Dust fell from the crumbling stone archway as Alara forced the rusted iron door open. For generations, her family believed they were nothing more than cursed, penniless immigrants. What lay buried beneath this forgotten Scottish ruin wouldn't just rewrite her bloodline. It would make them targets for very dangerous people. Alara Harrington was intimately familiar with the crushing weight of inheritance, though not the kind that came with trust funds or sprawling estates. At 32, her inheritance consisted entirely of her late father's staggering medical debts and a shoebox full of unpaid final notices. Living in a cramped, drafty apartment in the outskirts of Boston, Alara worked 60-hour weeks as an architectural archivist, a job that barely kept the electricity on. Her family lore was equally bleak. Her great-grandfather, William Gallagher, was remembered only as a disgraced merchant who had abandoned his family in 1948, fleeing Europe with nothing and leaving his descendants to scrap for survival in America. That narrative, which had defined the Harrington family's bitter identity for over 70 years, shattered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The catalyst was a heavy, wax-sealed courier envelope that arrived at her desk, bearing the embossed letterhead of Carmichael, Davies and Forbes, a prestigious private wealth law firm based in Edinburgh, Scotland. Alara assumed it was another collections agency that had tracked her down, perhaps adopting an aggressive new tactic. Instead, the enclosed documents read like a bizarre, bureaucratic fairy tale. According to a senior solicitor named Alistair Davies, William Gallagher had not died a pauper in America. He had secretly returned to the Scottish Highlands in the late 1950s under an assumed corporate identity, purchasing Craigloch Castle, a formidable, isolated 16th-century fortress perched on the jagged cliffs of Sutherland. William had lived there in absolute seclusion until his death, leaving the property locked in a convoluted, decades-long probate trust. Now, the trust had expired, and Alara, as the last living blood relative, was the sole heir. But there was a catch, one that snapped Alara back to her harsh reality. The estate was saddled with £85,000 in back taxes and structural liability fines owed to the Crown estate. Under UK inheritance laws, she had exactly 30 days to claim the property, settle the debts, and liquidate the asset, or the government would seize it, potentially leaving her liable for the legal fees. Desperate, terrified, and seeing a fragile glimmer of hope to wipe out her father's medical debts, Alara liquidated her microscopic savings, maxed out her final credit card, and booked a brutal itinerary of layovers to Inverness. The reality of Scotland hit her the moment she stepped out of the regional airport. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the relentless coastal wind bit through her thin Boston peacoat. Alistair Davies met her in a sterile, wood-paneled office in the city centre. He was a severe, humorless man who seemed entirely unimpressed by her presence. "I must be frank with you, Miss Harrington," Davies said, sliding a thick stack of UK Form IHT 400 tax documents across his mahogany desk. "Craigloch is not a fairy tale palace. It is a hazardous, condemned ruin. The roof collapsed in the 80s. The foundations are compromised by sea rot. Frankly, the land is worth more than the stone. But the zoning laws make development nearly impossible." Before Alara could process the despair welling in her chest, Davies steepled his fingers. "However, you are exceedingly fortunate. A buyer has come forward, a corporate entity specializing in historical land preservation. They are willing to take the property off your hands today for £100,000. It clears your tax burden and leaves you with a modest £15,000 profit. I strongly advise you to sign." It was a lifeline. It was exactly what she needed. But Elara's career in architectural history had given her a sharp eye for discrepancies. She noticed the name of the purchasing company on the draft contract: Vanguard Holdings Limited. If the zoning laws make development impossible, why is a corporate holding company so eager to buy a collapsing liability? Elara asked, her eyes narrowing. Davies cleared his throat, a flicker of irritation crossing his stoic face. They have philanthropic initiatives. Miss Harrington, if you delay, this offer will vanish. I want to see it, Elara said firmly. I am not signing away my family's only asset without seeing it with my own eyes. The drive to Craigloch took 3 agonizing hours through winding, desolate Highland roads. When they finally arrived, Elara stepped out of Davies's idling Range Rover and had the breath knocked out of her. Craigloch Castle was a terrifyingly beautiful monstrosity. Built from black basalt, it loomed over the churning North Atlantic, a jagged silhouette against the grey sky. Half of the keep had crumbled, leaving the interior exposed like a rotting ribcage. Ivy, thick as anacondas, choked the remaining watchtowers. It was utterly worthless in a traditional real estate sense. As she stood in the freezing rain, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up behind them. Out stepped a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, completely out of place in the muddy Highlands. Davies suddenly looked incredibly nervous. Miss Harrington, the man said, offering a shark-like smile. I am Liam Croft, Director of Acquisitions for Vanguard Holdings. I understand you are hesitant to sign. Let's not play games. I'll double the offer right now. £200,000. Sign the papers on the hood of this car, and you can fly back to America, a very comfortable woman. Elara stared at Croft. His shoes were Italian leather, ruined by the mud. He was desperate, and people like Liam Croft didn't get desperate over worthless rocks. No, Elara said, her voice shaking but resolute. The price just went up. I'll be in touch. As Davies and Croft stared at her in stunned silence, Elara realized she had just made a very dangerous gamble. There was something hidden in Craigloch, and she was going to find out what it was. Elara spent her first 3 days in Scotland operating out of a damp, floral, wall-papered room at a local bed and breakfast in the nearby village of Durness. The owner, a pragmatic, sharp-eyed woman named Moira McIntyre, regarded Elara with a mix of pity and profound suspicion. When Elara mentioned she was the new owner of Craigloch, Moira paused mid-pour, spilling hot tea onto the saucer. You've Gallagher blood in you, then? Moira asked, her voice dropping to a hushed, wary register. Your great-grandfather was a ghost, lass. He bought that cursed rock, walled himself up, and the only people who ever went up that road were men in expensive motor cars who looked like they broke legs for a living. The soil there is sour. Sell it to those corporate suits and run back to America. The warning only fueled Elara's determination. Armed with heavy-duty flashlights, a crowbar, and a set of old architectural blueprints she had badgered out of the local historical registry, Elara drove her rented hatchback up to the ruins at dawn every morning. Her architectural training kicked in as she meticulously mapped the surviving structures. The Great Hall was impassable, buried under tons of collapsed slate roofing. The eastern watchtower was a sheer drop into the ocean. By the afternoon of her 3rd day, she focused her attention on the most intact structure, the old stone gatehouse. It was dark, smelling intensely of rotting wood and ancient sea salt. While inspecting the structural integrity of a massive cold hearth, Elara noticed an anomaly. The masonry on the left side of the chimney breast didn't interlock correctly with the surrounding 16th century stonework. It was a 1950s mortar job, hastily disguised to look old. Using her crowbar, Ilara chipped away at the crumbling mortar until a loose stone gave way, revealing a hollow cavity in the wall. Inside, wrapped heavily in thick, yellowed oilcloth, was a leather-bound ledger. She took it back to her car, her hands trembling as she turned on the overhead cabin light. The pages were filled with William Gallagher's frantic, cramped handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a paranoid inventory. The entries were bizarre, cryptic codes intermingled with terrified ramblings. "They are closing in. Vanguard suspects I took the Berlin cash. They don't know about the modifications to the foundation. The insurance policy is safe. Look to the bleeding stone beneath the salt cellar." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. The Berlin cash. Vanguard. Liam Croft's company had been chasing her great-grandfather's ghost for over half a century. The next morning, Ilara returned to the castle with a singular, dangerous focus. Finding the salt cellar required cross-referencing the local blueprints with medieval architectural standards. Meat and salt were always stored in the coolest, driest part of the lower levels, typically adjacent to the old kitchens. She navigated the treacherous, debris-filled corridors, finally descending a half-collapsed spiral staircase into the belly of the keep. The air here was dramatically colder, thick with an unnatural stillness. She found the remains of the kitchen, identified by a massive, rusted iron spit, and located an adjoining antechamber. This was the salt cellar. It was completely empty, save for a floor made of massive, uneven flagstones. Ilara dropped to her knees, shining her flashlight over the stones, the bleeding stone. She searched for an hour, her knees bruised and aching until her beam caught a dull, reddish glint. One of the large flagstones possessed a thick vein of crimson iron oxide running straight through its center. Ilara jammed the flat end of her crowbar into the crevice between the bleeding stone and the next. She pushed with all her weight, her muscles screaming in protest. With a harsh, grinding scrape that echoed through the empty castle, the stone pivoted on a hidden iron axle. A rush of stale, metallic-smelling air blew up into her face. Below was a jagged opening, leading to a set of stairs plunging into absolute darkness. Fear urged her to turn back, to call Moira, to call the police. But the memory of her father's unpaid bills and the sheer arrogance of Liam Croft propelled her forward. Gripping her flashlight like a weapon, Ilara descended. The stairs did not lead to a medieval dungeon. As she reached the bottom, her flashlight illuminated a terrifying juxtaposition. The walls were ancient stone, but the space had been aggressively retrofitted. Thick 1940s-era electrical conduits snaked along the ceiling, and blocking her path was a modern, heavy steel bank vault door. The vault door was partially ajar, the locking mechanism apparently jammed open by a rusted, bent iron rod, evidence of a hasty, desperate exit decades ago. Ilara squeezed through the heavy steel gap. As her flashlight swept the interior of the vault, she didn't find chests of gold or stolen art. Instead, the room was lined with row upon row of olive-green, military-grade filing cabinets and stacked wooden crates bearing faded German eagles and dates from 1944. She walked to the nearest cabinet, pulled open a heavy drawer, and withdrew a thick manila folder. It was entirely filled with original typed documents, photographs, and Swiss bank routing numbers. The names on the dossiers were staggering. Prominent mid-century British politicians, titans of American industry, and incredibly wealthy European aristocrats. As Ilara opened a second folder, a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the concrete floor. She picked it up. It was a crisp, black-and-white picture taken in 1943. It showed a group of high-ranking Nazi officers standing alongside a group of civilian businessmen. Written on the back of the photograph, in her great-grandfather's handwriting, were the names of the men. The civilian businessmen were the founding partners of Vanguard Holdings Limited. William Gallagher hadn't been a penniless merchant. He had been a master extortionist. He had somehow intercepted a massive trove of Nazi blackmail material at the end of the war, and he had used it to bleed Europe's most powerful, corrupt families dry for decades. He bought the castle not to live like a king, but to build an impenetrable fortress to hide his lethal leverage. Suddenly, a slow, echoing handclap sounded from the pitch-black staircase behind her. Elara spun around, dropping the folder. Standing in the vault doorway, holding a high-powered tactical flashlight that blinded her, was Liam Croft. The veneer of the corporate businessman was entirely gone. In his other hand, resting casually by his side, was a suppressed handgun. "I told Davies you were too smart to sign," Croft echoed, his voice dripping with malice. "Your great-grandfather was a parasite, Miss Harrington. He terrorized my employers for 30 years with what is in this room. Now, be a good girl, put the file down, and let's discuss how we're going to arrange your tragic, accidental fall from the castle cliffs." The blinding beam of Liam Croft's tactical flashlight pinned Elara against the rusted filing cabinets. The silence in the underground vault was suffocating, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing and the distant muted roar of the North Atlantic crashing against the cliffs above. "Put the folder down, Elara," Croft said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The suppressed barrel of his pistol remained perfectly level with her chest. "Let us not make this messier than it needs to be. You came looking for a fairy tale, but you stumbled into a corporate war that ended before you were even born." Elara's mind raced, her architectural archivist instincts violently overwhelmed by primal adrenaline. She tightened her grip on the manila folder, her knuckles turning white. "Vanguard Holdings," she breathed, forcing herself to keep talking, to buy seconds. "It was never a preservation society. It was a front. Your founders, Arthur Pendleton, Henry Carlyle, they built their empires on stolen Nazi assets. And my great-grandfather caught them." "William Gallagher was a brilliant, vicious parasite," Croft replied, taking a slow step into the vault. The heavy steel door loomed just behind him, still propped open by the rusted iron rod. He intercepted a courier plane in 1946, carrying the financial ledgers of the Third Reich's elite civilian collaborators. For 30 years, he bled our founders dry. He demanded millions in untraceable bearer bonds to keep these exact files out of the hands of the Nuremberg tribunals and the British government. When he died, the blackmail stopped. We thought the files were lost or destroyed, until the estate trust expired and you showed up." Croft gestured with the gun. "Now, slide the folder across the floor and interlock your hands behind your head." Elara lowered the folder, pretending her hands were shaking too violently to hold it. She let it slip from her grasp. As the thick stack of papers hit the concrete, it burst open, scattering 70-year-old treasonous documents across the floor. Croft's eyes darted down for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening she would ever get. Elara didn't run toward him. She lunged sideways, hurling her heavy cast-iron flashlight directly at his face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy metal struck Croft's shoulder as he flinched, throwing his aim off. The suppressed gun coughed, a sharp, violent crack, and a bullet sparked against the steel cabinet, inches from Elara's ear, showering her in hot lead fragments and ancient rust. Before Croft could correct his stance, Elara dove toward the vault entrance. She didn't aim for the doorway. She aimed for the floor. Sliding on the slick, damp concrete, Her heavy hiking boot slammed into the rusted iron rod, propping the massive vault door open. The rod gave way with a sharp screech. Decades of gravity and weighted hinges took over. The 3-ton World War II-era bank vault door swung shut with terrifying speed. Croft, realizing his fatal error, lunged forward, extending his arm to catch the door. His fingers brushed the steel frame just as the massive door slammed into its recess with a deafening, earth-shaking boom. The heavy locking bolts auto-engaged with a heavy clack. Elara scrambled backward on her hands and knees, gasping for air in the sudden, total darkness of the antechamber. From the other side of the impenetrable steel, she could hear the muffled, frantic pounding of Croft's fists, followed by the dull thud of a gunshot as he desperately tried to shoot the locking mechanism. It was useless. The vault had been designed to withstand an aerial bombardment. Trembling violently, Elara pulled her backup penlight from her pocket. The narrow beam illuminated the jagged stone stairs. She had trapped him, but she was trapped in Scotland, with a corporate syndicate undoubtedly waiting for Croft's check-in call. She crawled back up the spiral stairs, pushed past the bleeding stone in the salt cellar, and ran blindly through the ruined corridors of Craigloch Castle. The freezing Highland rain hit her face like glass as she sprinted to her rental car. She threw it into gear, tearing down the muddy driveway, leaving the haunted fortress behind. She couldn't go to the local police. If Vanguard Holdings had enough power to buy off historical registries and send armed fixers in bespoke suits, a local Highland constable would be a fatal gamble. She needed a nuclear option. When Elara burst through the doors of the Durness bed and breakfast, she was covered in stone dust, grease, and a thin streak of blood from the ricochet. Moira McIntyre dropped a stack of linen towels, her pragmatic face draining of color. "Lock the doors," Elara ordered, her voice cracking. "And tell me you have a secure landline. They're going to come looking for him." Moira didn't ask questions. She took one look at Elara's eyes, bolted the heavy oak door, and pulled down the blinds. "My nephew," Moira whispered fiercely, pulling a rotary phone from beneath the reception desk. "David Holbrook. He's a senior investigator for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in London. He's taken down Russian oligarchs. If you've found what I think you've found in that cursed castle, he's the only one who can keep you breathing." The next 48 hours were a blur of geopolitical chaos, orchestrated entirely from a damp, floral wall-papered dining room in the Scottish Highlands. Moira McIntyre had transformed her quaint bed and breakfast into a makeshift fortress. She kept the heavy oak doors bolted, the tartan curtains drawn tight, and a pot of aggressively strong tea brewing at all hours. David Holbrook did not take Elara's frantic, breathless claims lightly. Operating out of London, the investigative journalist knew the whispers surrounding Vanguard Holdings. Within 3 hours of their initial phone call, David had bypassed local authorities entirely, routing Elara's photographic evidence directly to a high-level contact at the Serious Fraud Office, SFO, and the National Crime Agency. By dawn the next morning, the desolate stretch of the A838 highway leading to the cliffs was completely locked down. Elara watched from the passenger seat of an unmarked police SUV as 3 tactical helicopters descended over the churning North Atlantic, their searchlights cutting through the thick Highland fog. Craigloch Castle was swarmed by heavily armed federal officers. They found Liam Croft exactly where Elara had left him. When they finally torched through the heavy steel locking mechanisms of the World War II-era bank vault, Croft was huddled in the freezing, absolute darkness, suffering from severe hypothermia, dehydration, and the psychological break of absolute defeat. He was hauled out in thermal shock blankets, his bespoke charcoal suit ruined, his arrogant sneer replaced by vacant terror. He was immediately taken into federal custody under armed guard, denied bail under the UK's sweeping anti-terrorism and organised crime acts. But the true explosion, the one that would dominate global headlines for months, happened when the SFO forensic accountants finally catalogued the contents of William Gallagher's olive green filing cabinets. The documents provided an unbroken, meticulously cross-referenced paper trail. It proved that Vanguard Holdings Limited, along with a dozen subsidiary shell companies, had actively laundered billions in stolen wartime assets, art, and gold through prominent global institutions. The ledgers named specific executives at major Swiss banks and implicated real estate conglomerates across Europe and North America. It was instantaneously classified as the largest financial and historical scandal of the 21st century. Arrest warrants were issued simultaneously in London, Frankfurt, New York, and Geneva. The aristocratic descendants of Arthur Pendleton and Henry Carlisle saw their sprawling estates raided by authorities. Vanguard Holdings' stock plummeted to zero in a single afternoon of panicked trading. The shadow syndicate that had terrorized William Gallagher and hunted Elara was entirely dismantled on live international television. 3 weeks later, the Highland mud had been traded for the sterile, air-conditioned environment of a sleek, glass-walled SFO conference room in London. Elara sat at a massive mahogany table, nursing a cup of terrible instant coffee. Across from her sat David Holbrook, looking exhausted but triumphant, and Alistair Davies. The severe inheritance lawyer was entirely stripped of his former condescension. Sweating profusely and looking a decade older, Davies had narrowly avoided a 20-year conspiracy sentence by turning state's evidence against Vanguard's board of directors, fully cooperating with the Crown. "There is one final matter, Miss Harrington," the lead SFO inspector said gently, stepping into the room. He slid a weathered, wax-sealed envelope across the glass table. "Our forensics team found this taped to the false bottom of the final filing cabinet in the vault. We've cleared it of evidential value. It's addressed to a Mary Gallagher." Elara's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she reached for the thick parchment. Mary was her grandmother. She carefully broke the brittle, crimson wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, yellowed paper, covered in her great-grandfather's cramped, precise handwriting, along with a heavy, metallic safety deposit key bearing a Swiss cross. "My dearest Mary, if you or your blood are reading this, it means I am dead, and the monsters who wear bespoke suits have finally been dragged into the light. I know history, and our family will remember me as a villain. Perhaps I was. I extorted the devil, and the devil's money is unimaginably heavy. I fled to America in 1948, not to abandon you, but to protect you. Vanguard's fixers had discovered my identity. If I had stayed, they would have slaughtered you, your mother, and your children just to get to these ledgers. I bought Craigloch to build a fortress they could never penetrate, and I made myself the sole, highly visible target of their wrath to keep their eyes off Boston. I could not send you the vast wealth I extracted, for their auditors watched your family's financial footprint for decades. I could only send the anonymous micro-donations, the cashier's checks you received in December that kept the heat on in your winter months. But I did not leave you with nothing. The blackmail money was dirty, but the interest it accrued over 30 years was carefully, legally scrubbed. Enclosed is the master cipher and the key to a blind, irrevocable trust held at UBS in Zurich. The insurance policy wasn't just the ledgers, Elara. If it is you reading this, it was your future. Use it to rebuild. Forgive an old ghost. With profound, enduring love, William. Elara stared at the letter, hot tears spilling fast down her cheeks, blurring the faded ink. The generational trauma of the Harrington family, the crushing, unrelenting poverty, her father's agonizing inability to pay for his medical treatments, the constant, suffocating shadow of failure, had all been a meticulously crafted, desperate shield. William Gallagher hadn't been a disgraced coward. He had been a sentinel. He had stood guard in a freezing Scottish ruin for decades, drawing the fire of a global syndicate so his family could live in anonymous safety. A month later, Elara Harrington stood on the jagged cliffs of Sutherland once more. The sky was unusually clear, the North Atlantic sparkling a brilliant, violent sapphire blue against the black rocks. Her life was utterly unrecognizable. The trip to Zurich had been surreal. The UBS Trust contained a staggering £42 million. The very first thing she had done was pay off her late father's medical debts in full, followed by a massive anonymous donation to the oncology wing that had treated him with such kindness. She had packed up her cramped apartment, quit her archivist job in Boston, and relocated to Edinburgh permanently. Behind her, an intricate network of heavy steel scaffolding hugged the ancient stone of Craigloch Castle. She had outright refused to sell the land to the Crown Estate or private developers. Instead, utilizing her architectural background and her newfound immense wealth, she had hired a premier firm to stabilize the ruins. She was converting the surrounding acreage into a heavily funded, heavily secured historical research center, dedicated entirely to uncovering and prosecuting financial war crimes. Moira McIntyre, now employed as the estate's very well-paid property manager, walked up the muddy path holding 2 steaming thermos cups of tea. She handed one to Elara, the Highland wind whipping their hair. "It looks less angry," Moira noted, gesturing to the castle's silhouette against the bright sky, a wry smile on her pragmatic face. "It's finally resting," Elara replied, taking a sip of the hot tea, feeling the profound warmth spread through her chest. The curse of the Gallagher bloodline was permanently broken, washed away by the very truth it had bled to protect. What a wild journey from a mountain of medical debt to dismantling a global syndicate. If Elara's brilliant escape and her great-grandfather's shocking ultimate sacrifice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. What would you have done if you found that vault? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more incredible, true-to-life storytelling every single week.